Tapping came before he heard her. Measured, patient, claws on wet concrete, each step the same distance from the last, the sound of something that had decided where it was going and was not in any particular hurry about arriving. Owen Marsh heard it and did not turn around. He was standing at the downstream railing of the Opequon Creek footbridge, both hands flat on the cold metal, looking at the water 20 feet below. The creek was low for November, a dark ribbon between pale limestone banks, barely catching the light from the one functioning street lamp at the east end of the bridge. The other lamp had been out for what looked like months, its housing dark and rusted, the county apparently having decided that this particular stretch of railing in this particular corner of West Virginia was not worth the maintenance budget. He had been standing here for 31 minutes. He knew the number because his phone was still in his jacket pocket, and he had checked it when he arrived. Not because he was waiting for anything, but because checking it was a habit, a reflex left over from 18 years of operations where the time always mattered, where the window was always specific, where the difference between 0322 and 0317 was the difference between reaching someone and not reaching them. 3:07 a.m. He was not going to jump. He wanted to be precise about that, even in his own mind, even standing here alone in the November dark with the creek below and nothing behind him but an empty parking lot and a closed bait shop and a 2-lane road that had not seen a car in the last 20 minutes. He was not going to jump. He was not thinking about jumping. He was thinking about nothing, which was the point, which was the only reason he was here and not in the motel room he was paying $48 a night for 6 blocks away. The motel room had walls. The walls had corners, and the corners had shadows, and the shadows at 3 a.m. had the specific quality of a room where a man had been alone for 11 weeks and had run out of the internal resources required to keep certain images at bay. Not nightmares, he had those too, but separately, and he had learned to manage them with the limited toolkit the VA had provided and the slightly more effective toolkit he had assembled himself over the years. This was something else. This was the waking kind, the kind that did not require sleep to arrive. He had come to the bridge because it was outside. That was the full extent of his plan. The tapping stopped. Owen kept his hands on the railing and his eyes on the water. He could feel, not see, feel, something behind him, the specific quality of attention that a person or an animal generated when they were focused on you, the way the air changed slightly, the way the back of your neck registered information that your eyes had not yet been asked to process. He had spent 18 years in environments where ignoring that sensation could get you killed, and the habit did not turn off cleanly just because the environment changed. He turned around. She was standing 7 feet away in the middle of the bridge's walking surface, directly under the one working street lamp. A German shepherd. Female, he could see that immediately from the build and the way she was carrying herself. Her coat was the standard black and tan, but it had gone rough and dull in the way that a dog's coat went when it had been a while since anyone had taken care of it. Not filthy, but weathered, the luster gone, the way good things looked after too long in uncertain conditions. Her ribs were present under the coat if you knew what to look for, the slight definition that meant she had been finding enough food to stay alive, but not enough to be comfortable. And her abdomen was low and heavy and unmistakable. She was not thin everywhere. She was thin where she should not have been and large where she should not have been, the specific configuration of an animal that was very close to the end of a pregnancy and had been carrying that weight without adequate support for longer than was good for her. She was looking at him, not toward him, at him. The distinction mattered. She had stopped moving with the precise positioning of something that had made a decision, settled into it, and was now simply waiting to see what happened next. Her ears were asymmetrical, the left one standing straight and alert, the right one folded at the tip, slightly, the way a healed injury sometimes left cartilage. Both were forward. Her tail was low but not tucked. Her eyes were dark and absolutely clear, and they held his with the sustained directness of an animal that had no interest in looking away first. She did not growl. She did not whine. She sat down, Not a collapse, not a settling. A deliberate sit, haunches meeting concrete with the unhurried economy of a dog that had been sitting and standing and moving through the world for years and understood the mechanics of it completely. She arranged herself and looked at him, and the bridge held them both in its small circle of light, and the creek moved under them without comment. Owen looked at her for a long moment. "Go home," he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected. He had not spoken since checkout at the front desk of the motel 6 hours ago, a transaction of 11 words. And before that, the VA appointment 2 days prior, which had been 17 minutes of a counselor named Greg asking him questions he answered in the flattest possible language, because the full-length version of any of those answers was not something he was prepared to offer to a man he had met 4 times. The voice sounded like his own, but used, like equipment that had been in storage. The dog did not move. "I'm not kidding," Owen said. "Go on." She blinked once. That was all. He pushed off the railing and turned to face her fully. She tracked the movement without alarm, ears adjusting 1 degree, weight shifting slightly forward, the small recalibrations of an animal monitoring a situation and finding nothing in it, yet that required a change of plan. Owen walked toward the east end of the bridge, the functioning lamp end, the way back to the parking lot and the bait shop and the county road. He got 11 feet before he stopped. Behind him, the tapping resumed, measured, patient, the same spacing as before. He did not look back. He stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets and listened to her follow him and felt, without wanting to feel it, the specific weight of the chisel-shaped object in his left pocket. Not a weapon, not a tool. A glove, one leather work glove, brown, size medium, the kind sold at every hardware store in every small town in America. His mother's. He had taken it from the box of her things the hospital gave him when he arrived. The box had been waiting at the nurse's station, his name written on a piece of surgical tape in a handwriting he didn't recognize. He had taken the glove without looking at it and put it in his pocket and had not examined it closely since, had not held it up to any particular light, had not done anything with it except carry it. And he could not have explained why, not in any language that would have satisfied Greg at the VA or anyone else who might have thought an explanation was owed. He just had not been able to put it down anywhere. The tapping stopped again. She had matched his pace exactly and was now standing 2 feet behind his left heel. When he turned, slowly, so as not to startle her, though nothing about her suggested startlement was a significant risk. She was there, looking up at him with that same patient directness, the dark eyes steady, the crooked ear pointing slightly east. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. The creek moved below. The good lamp buzzed faintly. At some point a truck went past on the county road, its headlights sweeping the parking lot for a moment without slowing, and the dog's ears both tracked it and returned to Owen before the sound of the engine had fully faded. "I don't have anything," he said. "No food, no water, nothing." She kept looking at him. "I can't help you." One slow blink. Owen stood there on the Opequon Creek footbridge at 3:14 a.m., a 47-year-old man with a dead phone and a leather glove and 11 weeks of nothing behind him, looking at a dog who had decided, for reasons he could not account for, that he was who she had been looking for. He did not go back to the railing. He sat down on the bridge surface instead, back against the railing post, legs out in front of him on the cold concrete. The dog did not move for a moment. Then she walked forward, 4 steps precise, and stopped 18 inches from his knee. She did not sit this time. She stood, and her breathing was visible in the cold air, and her abdomen moved with it, and Owen watched her breathe and felt for the first time in 11 weeks something that was not the absence of other things. He did not have a name for it. He did not try to find one. She stood 18 inches from his knee for a long time, not shifting, not pacing, just standing with her weight distributed evenly across all 4 legs, the way a dog stood when it was not nervous and not at ease, but simply present, occupying a position it had chosen and intended to hold. Her abdomen rose and fell. Her breath made small, even clouds in the cold air that dissipated before they reached Owen's face. He watched her breathe. He had been in enough emergency situations to know that watching something breathe was not nothing. You watched breathing when you were not sure it was going to continue. You watched it when the alternative was not watching it, and not watching it meant acknowledging a different set of possibilities. He had watched men breathe in the back of helicopters over terrain that had no name on any map he was authorized to carry. He had watched the rhythm of it the way you watched an instrument panel, for deviation, for the specific quality of change that preceded a worse change. This dog was breathing fine. He did not know why he found this relevant. He found it relevant. The temperature had dropped another degree or two in the last half hour. He could feel it in his hands, which were not gloved. He had left the motel without thinking about it, which was another thing he had been doing lately, leaving without thinking about the specific practical requirements of the environment he was entering. A PJ with 18 years in the service, a man who had pre-positioned gear in his sleep, who had run through contingency checklists in the shower, standing on a footbridge in November with no gloves. He put his hands in his pockets. His left hand found the leather glove and held it without meaning to. The dog's nose moved, not toward him, toward his pocket. One small lateral movement of the muzzle, barely an inch, and then she was still again, but something in her posture had changed fractionally, the way attention changed when it had found a specific point of interest and was deciding what to do with it. Owen watched her process whatever she was processing. It was hers, he said, not mine. The dog's ears adjusted. The straight one tilted forward a degree. The folded one did what it could. He had not intended to say that. He had not intended to say anything. He had been talking to no one for 11 weeks because the people available to talk to were either paid to listen or had their own losses to manage and did not need his added to the balance, and he had made his peace with that. Or he had made something, some functional arrangement with the silence that got him from one day to the next without requiring anyone else's involvement. He had just said 4 words to a dog on a bridge at 3 in the morning. He took his hand out of his pocket, not holding the glove, just his hand, which was cold. The dog looked at his hand. He looked at his hand. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then the dog stepped forward, 1 step, a single measured shift of weight, and extended her muzzle toward his knuckles. Not pressing, not nuzzling. The tip of her nose made contact with the back of his hand for less than 2 seconds, a touch so brief and deliberate it registered more as information than sensation. Then she pulled back. She sat down, 2 feet away now, and looked at his face. Owen did not move. He had not expected that. He did not know what he had expected. He had not been expecting anything, had not been in the business of expecting things for 11 weeks, because expectation required a relationship to the future that he had suspended in the interest of getting through the present. But he had not expected that specific gesture from this specific animal at this specific moment on this bridge. And it landed somewhere in him that was not entirely numb. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. She looked back. Her eyes were dark, not black, but the deep amber brown that sometimes looked black in low light. And they held his without the social discomfort that eye contact carried in most interactions. Dogs did not look away from things that interested them. They did not look away to be polite or to manage the other party's comfort. She was looking at him because he was there, and she had decided he was worth looking at, and that was the full extent of the transaction. He had been looked at by a lot of people in the last 11 weeks. The hospital staff who handed him the box, the VA intake coordinator with her clipboard and her careful questions, Greg, the counselor, with his specific brand of attentiveness that was professional and genuine and somehow both at once. His unit commander, who had called twice and left voicemails that Owen had listened to and not returned because the sound of that voice pulled him back to a place he was not ready to go. The motel clerk who had stopped asking if he needed anything by the 4th day because Owen's answers had made it clear that he did not know how to receive the question. None of them had looked at him the way this dog was looking at him. They had looked at him and seen something that required management, something that needed to be handled correctly, responded to appropriately, steered away from edges. This dog was looking at him and seeing. He did not know what she was seeing. He only knew that whatever it was, she had looked at it and sat down, and she had not left. He thought about that. He thought about the fact that she had been on this bridge before he arrived. He was certain of that now, certain in the way you were certain of things you hadn't witnessed, but could reconstruct from available information. The worn look of her, the deliberateness of her approach, not the approach of an animal that had stumbled across something, but the approach of one following a route it had already chosen. She had not come to this bridge because he was here. She had come to this bridge, and he had been here, and she had made an assessment. He thought about what that assessment might have consisted of. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The battery was at 4%. He looked at the screen for a moment, no missed calls, which was information of its own kind, and then at the dog. She was watching the phone with the same attention she gave everything, neutral and complete. He had 3 numbers he could call. His unit commander, a buddy from his last deployment, Marcus, who was back in Colorado and who had sent a text 3 weeks ago that Owen had read but not answered, and the VA crisis line, which Greg had written on a card and pressed into his hand at the end of their last session with the specific care of someone who understood that the card might matter at a moment when nothing else was available. He put the phone back in his pocket without calling any of them. Battery would be dead in 20 minutes, regardless. "You should go," he said to the dog, "wherever you came from, wherever that is." She looked at him. "I'm not." He stopped, started again. "I don't have anything for you. I told you that already." She blinked once, slowly, the full closing and opening of both eyes, the gesture that in dogs carried no particular meaning and which he was not going to assign meaning to because he was a 47-year-old man with a graduate-level understanding of stress responses and a pragmatic relationship to sentimentality. He stood up. His knee registered the cold concrete the way it always did, a dull, specific complaint from the joint that had been reconstructed after a hard landing in 2019 and had been making its opinions known ever since. He straightened and looked at the east end of the bridge, and then at the dog. She stood up when he stood up, not immediately. A half-second delay, as if she had considered staying seated and decided against it. She rose with the slightly careful movement of a heavily pregnant animal, the adjustment of balance, the redistribution of weight. Then she was standing, looking at him, and her tail moved twice. Not the vigorous demonstration of enthusiasm, but something quieter and more considered, a minimal acknowledgement that the situation had changed, and she was noting the change. Owen walked toward the parking lot end of the bridge. He got 14 feet. The tapping resumed behind him, measured, patient, the exact same interval as before. He stopped. He stood there with his hands at his sides and listened to her footsteps, closed the distance between them, and stopped 3 feet behind his left heel. And he thought about a lot of things, and then he stopped thinking about them and simply stood there. The creek moved below. The one working lamp held its small radius of light. He turned around. She was there. Of course she was there. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back with the patient, anchored attention of an animal that had made a decision some time ago and was simply waiting for the other party to finish arriving at theirs. "Okay," he said finally. Not to her, not exactly, more in the direction of the air between them, the cold November air that smelled of creek water and dead leaves and the particular mineral quality of wet limestone. He sat back down on the concrete. She walked forward, 4 steps, and this time she did not stop at 18 inches. She stopped at 6, close enough that her breath was visible between them, close enough that he could see, in the street lamp light, the slight unevenness of her breathing, the way it had started to change in the last few minutes, a fractional irregularity in the rhythm, a held quality on the exhale that had not been there before. He noticed this the way he noticed all breathing. His hand, without instruction, moved from his knee to the concrete beside him, palm flat, not reaching toward her, not offering anything, simply present. She lowered her head and put her nose 6 inches from his palm. Not touching, just near. He did not move his hand. 2 hours passed on that bridge the way hours passed in field conditions, not in sequence, not as a progression from one numbered minute to the next, but in a series of present moments that accumulated without apparent order, and then were simply gone, behind you, part of a landscape you could not see anymore because you were no longer facing that direction. Owen had learned this in his first deployment. Time in the field was not linear, it was textured. Some minutes were very long and some were very short, and the body kept its own accounting, separate from the clock, and the two records did not always match. He sat on the concrete, and the dog stood near him, and the creek moved under the bridge, and the temperature settled somewhere below 35 degrees, and stayed there. He talked to her. He did not decide to. It began the way things began when there was no one monitoring whether they should begin, gradually, without announcement, without the internal preparation he had learned to require before saying anything real to another person. He said something small and factual about the cold, and she did not respond, and he said something else, and she still did not respond, and the absence of response turned out to be, unexpectedly, the exact condition he had needed without knowing he needed it. She listened with her whole body. Not with engagement. She did not lean toward him or tilt her head or perform the specific pantomime of interest that people performed when they were trying to communicate that they were listening. She simply did not look away, did not reorient her attention to something more pressing, did not offer an expression that told him he was making her uncomfortable, or that she was managing her reaction to what he was saying. She stood in the cold and breathed and looked at him, and whatever he said fell into that attention the way a stone fell into still water, absorbed, surrounded, taken in. He talked about Syria first. Not the operation itself, not the mechanics of it, the coordinates and the weather window, and the specific sequence of decisions that had led to the specific outcome. He had recited those details enough times that they had become a document rather than a memory, something he could produce on request without experiencing the production of it. He did not want to recite the document. He talked instead about the thing he had never said aloud to anyone, not to Greg, not to his commander, not to Marcus, who had called from Colorado and left a voicemail that was still sitting unlistened to in his phone. He talked about the weight of the decision, not the content of it, the weight. There had been 4 men. There had been room for 3. He had been the one standing at the door of the helicopter, and the helicopter was taking fire, and the pilot had said what the pilot said in the specific clipped language of a pilot who has already made peace with the physics and is waiting for the human element to catch up. Owen had looked at 4 men and made a calculation that had nothing wrong with it, nothing he could point to even now, 11 weeks later, sitting on a bridge in West Virginia at 4 in the morning. The calculation was correct. The triage was sound. He had made the same kind of call a dozen times in 18 years, and he had been right every time, which was the entire point of the training, which was what 18 years of doing this work produced in a person if the person was paying attention. He had been right. Corporal Denny Reeves had not made it out. And being right and losing someone and knowing that being right was the reason you had lost him, that was a specific kind of weight that did not have a proper name in any of the literature Greg had recommended or any of the conversations Owen had allowed himself to have. Survivor guilt was the nearest label, and it did not fit. He had not survived instead of Denny Reeves. He had made the mathematically correct decision that resulted in Denny Reeves not surviving. Those were different things. The first one was grief. The second one was something that lived in a room with no windows and no door that Owen had not yet found a way to enter or to leave. The dog's nose moved again, toward his pocket. He took the glove out. He did not know why. He had carried it for 3 weeks without taking it out, without holding it up to look at it, without doing anything with it except feel its weight against his thigh as a kind of constant, a fixed point in a sequence of days that had very few of those. He held it now in the street lamp light and looked at it properly for the first time. It was a work glove, hardware store variety, the kind sold in bundles of 3 pairs for $11. Brown leather, palm reinforced, the stitching gone white at the thumb joint from use. His mother had kept a pair of these in her gardening basket for years. He could not have said how many years. Long enough that the gloves had become part of the specific inventory of her, the details that assembled themselves into a person in the way that a few objects assembled themselves into a life. She had been gardening when the diagnosis came. That was what she had told him on the phone 3 months before he shipped out for the last time. She'd been out back with her tomatoes, and she'd come inside for a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table because her legs felt wrong. And that was the beginning of the thing that ended 11 weeks ago in a hospital room in Martinsburg that Owen had been 7 hours too late to reach. He had been on a plane. He had been on a plane, and she had been in a room alone, and the phone in his pocket had rung with a number he recognized, and he had answered it, and the voice on the other end had been careful and professional, and had told him that Eleanor Marsh had passed at 4:22 a.m. peacefully in her sleep. He had been somewhere over the Atlantic. He sat with the glove in his hands and the dog 3 feet away, and the cold coming up through the concrete beneath him, and he said his mother's name out loud for the first time since the hospital. Eleanor. The dog's ears moved, the straight one forward, the folded one doing what it could. She took 1 step toward him, not the careful measured step of before, but something slightly different, something with less deliberation in it and slightly more weight, as if the distance between them had suddenly required less negotiation. She stopped 2 feet away. He looked at her. She was breathing differently now. He had been tracking it for the last 20 minutes without meaning to, his nervous system doing what it had been trained to do, monitoring the respiration of something that needed monitoring. And the rhythm had shifted. Not dramatically. Nothing was wrong in any way he could immediately identify. But the exhale had a quality to it now, a mild deliberateness, a slight extension, the breathing of a body that was beginning to organize itself around something other than rest. He knew what that meant. He had assisted in 3 field deliveries in 18 years, 2 human, 1 canine, under conditions that made this bridge in November look like a surgery suite. He knew the progression. He knew the timeline. He knew that what he was seeing was early, that there was still time, that the bridge was not yet the crisis point. He also knew that he was sitting on a footbridge in rural West Virginia at 4:15 in the morning with a dead phone and no vehicle, and the nearest veterinary clinic was 12 minutes away by car, and he did not have a car. He needed to think about this practically. He had been a man who thought practically for 18 years. He had thought practically in environments where the failure to think practically resulted in the permanent end of thinking for someone in the vicinity. He could do this. He cataloged what he had: 1 jacket, heavy canvas, rated to about 25 degrees. The clothes he was wearing, which were adequate for a 40-minute walk in November, but not for an extended period on cold concrete in a sustained wind. The leather glove. 1, not a pair, which was not useful as thermal protection, but was something. $43 in his wallet. A dead phone. He cataloged what he needed. Warmth, a contained space, or at least a windbreak. Clean hands, or as clean as available conditions allowed. Something absorbent. Transportation to a clinic when the time came, or a phone to call one. He stood up. The dog tracked the movement. Her weight shifted. He walked to the east end of the bridge, not away this time. He knew the difference now between walking away and walking with a purpose. And looked at the parking lot. The bait shop was closed and dark, a cinder block building with a corrugated metal awning over the entrance that blocked the wind from the north. Under the awning, against the wall, there was a wooden pallet that had been there long enough to look permanent. He went back to the dog. She was watching him approach with the alert patience she had given everything. Ears forward, weight steady, the breathing that had changed and was continuing to change. He sat back down on the concrete in front of her. He needed someone to hear him. He needed a phone. He needed those things in that order, and he had neither. He had a dog on a bridge and 43 degrees of November and a leather glove in his hand, and he was thinking about Denny Reeves and his mother and the specific loneliness of being a man who was very good at arriving too late to things that mattered. He looked at the glove. He thought about his mother in her garden, crouched between the tomato stakes, gloves on, not looking up, the way she worked when she was thinking through something, methodically, without drama, attending to the thing directly in front of her until it was done. She had told him something on their last phone call. He had been preparing for deployment, and she had been recovering from the second round of treatment, and she had called him at 0600 his time because she never entirely adjusted to the time zone difference, and she said, with the particular directness of a woman who had decided that her remaining time was too short for the long way around anything, "Owen, I need you to hear me. Are you listening?" He had said yes. She had said, "The hardest thing is not the big decision. The big decision takes care of itself when the time comes. You've always known how to do that. The hardest thing is what to do after. When there's no mission and no order, and it's just you in the next minute. That's where I want you to find your feet, not in the big moment. After," he had said, because he was a man preparing for a deployment, and his mother was telling him something he did not know how to hold. "I know, Mom." He had not known. He sat on the bridge and held the glove and looked at the dog, whose breathing had shifted again, and who was looking back at him with dark, clear, utterly patient eyes. And he thought that he still did not know exactly what she had meant. But he thought he was beginning to have a working theory. The dog made a sound. Not a bark, nothing that loud, nothing that sharp. A low sound from somewhere in the chest, not distress exactly, but an informational sound, the sound of a body beginning to insist on something. She lowered herself to the concrete. Not a collapse. A deliberate lowering, front legs first, then haunches, until she was lying on her side on the cold, wet surface of the bridge, and her abdomen contracted visibly once, and then released, and her breathing became the purposeful, rhythmic breathing of a body that had moved past preparation into something else entirely. Owen looked at her for 1 second. Then he took his jacket off. He folded the jacket twice and placed it on the concrete beside her. She did not look at him. She was past the point of looking at him. Her attention had turned entirely inward, toward the specific and consuming work her body had begun, and Owen understood that his role had shifted. He was no longer the subject of her assessment. He was the person present, the available resource, the pair of hands in the vicinity. He had been that before. He had been that in the back of helicopters and on hillsides, and in one instance on the floor of a livestock barn in Kunar Province at 2 a.m, while a sandstorm made the walls flex inward. He had been the person present more times than he could accurately count, and he had never once resented it, had in fact understood it as the only version of purpose that had ever made complete sense to him. Not the mission, not the objective, not the strategic rationale that existed 3 levels above his pay grade, but this. Someone needed something done, and he could do it, and so he did it. He moved into position. His hands were cold. He pressed them together for 30 seconds, working the circulation back into the fingers, then pressed both palms flat against his thighs for additional warmth. Inadequate. It would have to be sufficient. The first one came at 4:31 a.m. He knew the time because he had checked his phone one last time before it died. The screen flickering on for 4 seconds, long enough to read 4:28, then gone. He counted from there. The first one came and was fine, small, dark, already moving before Owen had fully registered its arrival, the automatic, insistent movement of a newborn animal asserting its presence in the world before it understood what the world was. He cleared the sack, checked the airway, guided it toward Nova's flank. She turned her head, briefly, minimally, acknowledged the arrival with a single pass of her tongue, and returned to the work of the next one. Owen sat back on his heels and breathed. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, or not only from cold. He recognized this. He had shaken like this before, not during, never during, but in the brief spaces between actions when the body took stock of what it had just done and produced a physical accounting. He had learned not to fight it. The shaking was not weakness. It was the nervous system releasing what it had held during the performance of the task, doing its own paperwork after the fact. He pressed his hands to his thighs again and waited. The second one came 6 minutes later and was also fine, smaller than the first, slightly slower to move, but moving, breathing, present. Owen placed it beside its sibling against Nova's belly and watched them both find what they needed without being shown how to find it. He thought briefly about the strangeness of competence, the way a body knew things the mind had not consciously learned, the way 18 years of training had deposited information so deep in him that it operated below decision-making, below intention, below the part of him that had been standing on a railing 40 minutes ago with no particular plan for the next hour. His hands had known what to do. They had simply known. He had not given them instructions. He had not needed to. He thought about Denny Reeves. He thought about the moment on the helicopter. Not the decision. He had done enough thinking about the decision, but the moment just after, when the door closed and the aircraft lifted, and Owen had been standing at the window, and the ground below had still been there, still carrying what it carried, and his hands had been clean and useless at his sides. The third one came at 4:44 a.m. He knew something was wrong before it was fully present. He had felt this before, too. The specific quality of wrong that arrived not as information, but as a change in atmospheric pressure, a shift in the texture of a moment that the trained nervous system registered before the conscious mind had assembled the data into language. His hands moved without the instruction to move. It was not breathing. He worked with the same systematic efficiency he brought to everything, clearing, checking, the specific sequence of steps that the situation called for, one after the other, without urgency or panic, because urgency and panic were the enemies of the work, and he had excised them from his operational kit years ago. He worked for 90 seconds. He worked carefully. He worked with the full concentrated competence of a man who had been trained by the United States Air Force at a cost of several $100,000 specifically to perform this kind of intervention under adverse conditions. He set it down on the jacket. He sat back. He looked at his hands. Nova made no sound. She turned her head, looked at the still form on the jacket for 2 seconds, then turned away. She licked the first two. She did not look back at the third. Owen did not know what to make of this and did not try to make anything of it. He only knew that watching her turn away was one of the harder things he had witnessed, and he had witnessed things that had taken up permanent residence in the least accessible rooms of his memory. He picked up the third one and moved it gently to the side, away from the others, and placed it in the fold of the jacket's collar where it would be still and covered and not in the way. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The fourth one came at 4:51 a.m. and it was fine. Owen assisted without thinking, checked without thinking, placed it without thinking, and then sat back on his heels in the cold dark on the Oppaquan Creek footbridge and looked at 3 small living things moving against their mother's belly, and one that was not moving, and the creek going under them in its continuous indifferent way. And something broke in him. Not loudly, not with the violence of something that had been under pressure and finally gave, more like a door that had been held shut with consistent and determined effort for a very long time, and the hand holding it had simply tired, and the door moved, and what was behind it was not the emergency. He had been managing it as but simply weight, the accumulated and specific weight of 11 weeks and 18 years and a helicopter window over terrain with no name on any map, and a phone that rang over the Atlantic at an altitude of 31,000 feet, and was answered too late. He put both hands over his face. His shoulders moved. He was not making sound or very little sound. He was not built for sound in this direction, had not cried in any observable way since he was 11 years old, and had decided with the complete conviction of an 11-year-old that observable grief was a form of information about yourself that you did not need to distribute freely. But his shoulders moved, and his hands were wet, and the bridge held him, and the cold held him, and the creek moved under him, and none of it required anything from him, and that turned out to be exactly what was needed. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. He was not timing it. When he lowered his hands, the leather glove was no longer in his left fist. He did not remember releasing it. It had fallen to the concrete to his left, landing with the flat sound of something small and soft meeting a hard surface. And Nova, between the careful attentions she was paying to her 3 living children, turned her head and put her nose 6 inches from it. She did not pick it up. She did not nudge it. She simply held her nose near it for a moment, reading whatever it carried, and then returned to her children. Owen looked at the glove on the concrete. He looked at his hands. They were steadier now than they had been during the delivery, steadier than they had any right to be given the temperature and the hour and everything that had preceded this moment. He turned them over, looked at the palms, looked at the knuckles, looked at the specific geography of them that he had been looking at for 47 years, without ever quite seeing as anything other than functional equipment. His mother had held these hands when he was small enough that her hand contained his entirely. When he came home on leave and she would reach across the kitchen table and put her hand over his without ceremony, without explanation, the gesture of a woman who had already said everything she needed to say and was simply marking the fact of his presence. He thought about the last time he had been in that kitchen. 4 years ago. Christmas. She had made the pie she always made, the one with the lattice crust that required more effort than pies needed to require, and she had done it with her work gloves, sitting on the counter beside her because she always forgot to put them away after the morning garden check. The gloves had been there in the kitchen light, brown and worn, and he had not looked at them because they were not remarkable, because they were simply part of the inventory of her, part of the specific texture of that kitchen and that house and that woman who had built a life in it without complaint and without audience. He reached over and picked up the glove from the concrete. He held it in both hands this time. Nova's 3 children were breathing. They were moving. They were small and ungainly and unaware of the bridge and the cold and the hour, and the man sitting 3 feet away from them who had gotten them here, and they would never be aware of it. And that was entirely appropriate, and Owen found that he did not need them to be aware of it. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked up at the sky. The cloud cover had thinned while he had been occupied, and through the gap directly overhead there were stars. Not many, not a clear night's worth, but enough, a handful of cold fixed points above West Virginia at 5 in the morning, above a footbridge over a creek that did not know the name of anything that had happened on it tonight. He looked at the stars for a moment. Then he looked back down at the dog and her children. He was still cold. He was still sitting on concrete. He still had $43 and a dead phone and no particular plan. But his hands had done what they knew how to do, and Nova was breathing. He needed to move them. That was the practical reality, and he returned to it the way he always returned to practical realities. Not because feeling things was wrong, but because feeling things and doing nothing were 2 different conditions, and only one of them was useful to the situation at hand. The bridge was exposed. The temperature was not going to rise for another 3 hours at minimum. 3 newborns and a mother who had been running on insufficient resources for months needed a windbreak, warmth, contained space. He had assessed the bait shop awning from the east end of the bridge, and it was the best available option within reasonable distance. The problem was Nova. He could carry the pups. He had done the math on that. 3 trips, 15 feet each way. Manageable. But Nova was 90 pounds of dog who had just delivered 4 times in 45 minutes and had not yet indicated any interest in going anywhere. And he could not carry her, and he could not leave her, and he could not move the pups without her following, because she would follow, and the following would cost her energy she did not have to spare. He needed her to trust him enough to walk. He sat with this for a moment. He thought about the things he knew about trust, which were mostly operational, how it was built between team members under pressure, how it failed and why, how it transferred from person to person in environments where there was no time for the slow accumulation of shared experience. He had built trust in 12-minute windows. He had to. You learned to read the specific signals of it, to recognize when a person had decided you were the one they were going to believe in this moment in this location, regardless of what came before, because the alternative to belief in the available resource was paralysis, and paralysis was not survivable. He did not know if dogs worked the same way. He suspected, watching Nova, that they might. He did not move immediately. He sat where he was and let the situation be what it was for a few more minutes. 3 pups warm and moving against their mother, the small sounds of them, the cold air, the creak. And then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He asked for help, not aloud. He was not a man who spoke prayers in any form he could have named to Greg or anyone else. Had not been since his early 20s, when the gap between what he asked for and what the world provided had become too consistent to ignore. But sitting on that bridge with his jacket folded under 3 newborn German shepherds and a dead phone in his pocket and a leather glove in both hands, he put his head down for a moment and he said, without sound, without direction, without any particular confidence that the request had a recipient, "I need some help here." He raised his head. The eastern sky was the color of old pewter now, the specific gray that came before the specific gray that came before dawn, the sky doing its slow preparatory work above the ridgeline. Somewhere in the bait shop parking lot, a bird started and stopped and started again. Owen put the glove in his shirt pocket, against his chest where it would be warm. Then he stood up slowly, making no sudden movements, letting Nova track him without alarm. She watched him rise with her ears forward and her 3 children arranged against her belly, and her eyes held the same quality they had held all night. Not warm, not cold, just present, the steady attention of an animal that had been paying attention to this specific human for several hours and had accumulated enough data to make considered assessments. He crouched back down to her level. He held out his hand, palm up, 3 inches from her nose. Not demanding, not requesting, offering. The small offering of a surface, a scent, a point of contact that she could evaluate and accept or not accept on her own terms. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. Then she put her nose in his palm. Not the brief touch of earlier, not the fractional contact of an animal still deciding, but a full press, warm and deliberate, the muzzle settling into his palm with the unhurried commitment of something that had finished deliberating. She held it there for 4 seconds. Then she lifted her head and looked at him, and her tail moved. Once, low and certain. Owen felt this in a place he did not have cartographic information for. He did not try to locate it. He only registered it and held it the way he held things that were too specific to categorize, filed under the heading of things that were true without being explainable. He stood up the rest of the way. He gathered the 3 pups in his jacket, carefully, speaking quietly while he did it. Not words exactly, just sound, the low, even sound of a human voice doing its oldest work, the work that predated language, and carried them to the bait shop awning in 2 trips, settling them in the corner where the wall met the concrete pad, sheltered from the north wind on 2 sides. When he came back for the 2nd trip, Nova was on her feet. She had not waited to be asked. She had risen at some point while he was gone. He hadn't seen it, had not been there for the specific moment of decision. And she was standing with her weight collected under her, not steady but determined, the posture of an animal that understood where it needed to go and had committed to the getting there ahead of the arrival. He walked beside her. She walked beside him. 14 feet from the bridge to the parking lot edge, another 12 to the awning. She made it without assistance, without stopping, the movement slow and deliberate and costing her something he could see in the careful placement of each step. The minimal expenditure of a body operating on reduced reserves, spending what it had to spend on the necessary things. She lowered herself in the corner beside her pups and did not get up again. He sat down beside her, not at distance, not 18 inches, not 2 feet, not the calibrated proximity of earlier in the night when every inch between them had been a negotiation. He sat close enough that his back was against the same wall, his hip 6 inches from her flank, his legs stretched out on the cold concrete under the awning while the gray morning assembled itself overhead. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Nova shifted her weight. She moved her head, slowly, the movement carrying in it the specific heaviness of a body that had completed extraordinary work and was now settling into whatever came after. And she placed it on his thigh. Not near. On. The full weight of it, the broad skull and the warm muzzle, the folded ear turned upward against his leg and the straight ear falling to the side, the weight of her head on his thigh with the simple finality of something finding the place it had been looking for and deciding that the looking was done. He did not move. He looked down at her and at the 3 small animals arranged against her belly, and at the concrete and the parking lot beyond the awning edge where the gray morning was arriving in its unhurried way. And he felt the weight of her head on his leg, and he sat with it. He thought about his mother. He thought about her specific weight when he was small, the weight of her hand on his back when he was sick, the weight of her sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, the particular gravity of her presence in a room that changed the room in ways he had never been able to articulate but had always been able to feel. She had been a physical fact in his life the way very few things were physical facts. Not an idea, not a relationship, not a construct of memory and association, but a weight, a warmth, a specific and irreplaceable density. He had been trying for 11 weeks to understand where that weight had gone. He was not sure it had gone anywhere. He looked down at Nova. Her breathing was slow now, slower than it had been all night, the breathing of a body that had arrived somewhere and could release the effort of transit. Her 3 pups were breathing too, the small, rapid breathing of new things that did not yet know the world was difficult. He could feel the warmth of them from where he was sitting. Not much warmth. Enough. He reached into his shirt pocket. He took out the glove and held it between both hands and turned it over once. He thought about his mother crouched between the tomato steaks in the August heat, methodical and unhurried, attending to the thing directly in front of her. He thought about what she had told him on that last phone call, not the big decision. After. Where I want you to find your feet. He thought about 11 weeks of not finding them. He thought about this. A bridge, a dog, a night he had not planned, 3 small animals breathing in a corner under an awning in West Virginia. And his hands, which knew things he had not remembered, they knew. He was still here. He was sitting on concrete at 5:40 in the morning with no phone and no plan, and $43, and a dead phone, and a dog's head on his thigh, and 3 newborn German shepherds against his knee. And he was still here, and his hands were warm from the work they had done, and the morning was coming whether he had a plan for it or not. He heard footsteps. Not immediately. At some distance, the sound of someone crossing the parking lot on the far side, the specific rhythm of a person out early for a reason. He did not tense. He looked toward the sound and waited. A woman, middle 60s, in a walking jacket and trail shoes, with the purposeful gait of someone who did this every morning and had done it for years. She came around the corner of the bait shop and stopped. She looked at him. She looked at Nova. She looked at the 3 pups. She said, "Good Lord." Owen said, "I need to borrow a phone." She already had it out. The woman's name was Judith. She did not ask questions while he made the call. She stood at a respectful distance with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the sky and gave him the privacy of the call, which was the specific kind of grace that some people carried naturally, without instruction, without knowing they were doing it. The emergency veterinary clinic in Martinsburg opened at 6. The after-hours line connected him to a technician named Carol who took the information he gave her without audible alarm. Location, 4 newborns, mother's condition, ambient temperature, and told him she would have someone ready when he arrived and to keep them warm on the way over. Judith drove a 2019 Subaru with a dog bed in the back, which she mentioned without commentary, as if it were simply a feature of the vehicle rather than information he might find relevant. He found it relevant. They got Nova and the pups into the back without incident. Nova allowed herself to be lifted, Owen taking the weight of her, feeling the full 90 pounds of her, the residual warmth of her, and settled immediately onto the dog bed with her pups tucked against her and did not lift her head again until they arrived. Owen sat in the front passenger seat with his jacket folded in his lap. Judith drove without speaking. The county road was empty at that hour, the fields on either side still dark, the first real light just beginning at the ridgeline to the east. He watched it come. At some point, Judith said, "You do this professionally?" He thought about it. "I used to," he said. She nodded as if that answered more than he had intended it to, and did not say anything else. The clinic was a low brick building on the edge of town with a light on above the entrance, and a technician already at the door when Judith pulled up. The technician was young, precise, efficient in the way of people who had learned their competence recently enough that it still had urgency in it. She took Nova and the pups through the back without ceremony, asked Owen 3 clinical questions, and told him to wait in the front room. He waited. The front room had plastic chairs and a low table with magazines from the previous spring, and a wall clock that read 6:14 a.m. He sat in the chair nearest the window and watched the parking lot get light. Judith had offered to stay, and he had told her she didn't need to, and she had looked at him for a moment, not with concern exactly, with the specific attention of someone making an assessment. And then she had pressed her card into his hand and told him to call if he needed a ride. He held the card. He sat with the card in one hand and his mother's glove in the other, and the morning coming through the window glass and the clock on the wall, marking time in the ordinary way of clocks. At 6:48 the technician came back. Nova was stable, dehydrated, underweight, but no complications from the delivery. The 3 pups were small but viable. They would need monitoring. She said this in the careful language of someone delivering good news with appropriate qualifications, and Owen listened to all of it and nodded and said thank you, which came out less steady than he intended. She paused. "Are you her owner?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't know yet," he said. The technician looked at him for a moment in the way that people looked at veterans when they recognized one, which was a look he usually managed around, but did not manage around this morning. Then she said they would need someone to authorize the treatment costs, and he took out his wallet and put $43 on the counter and said he would figure out the rest. She slid the $43 back to him. "We have a fund," she said, "for situations." He looked at the money on the counter. He picked it up and put it back in his wallet and said, "Thank you again." And this time it came out the way he meant it. She let him go back. Nova was on a padded surface under a warming lamp, the 3 pups arranged along her belly, all of them sleeping with the dense, uncomplicated sleep of animals that had arrived somewhere safe. The room was warm. It smelled of antiseptic and animal, and the particular clean smell of a place designed to help things recover. Owen sat down on the stool beside her. She opened one eye. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then he took the glove from his pocket. The last time, the final time, the time he had been moving toward without knowing it since the night the box had been handed to him at a nurse's station with his name on surgical tape, and he turned it over in the light. The outside of the glove was unremarkable. Brown leather, worn, the stitching gone pale at the seams. He looked at the inside. Along the cuff in the interior where the leather lining met the hem, someone had written in black permanent marker in the small precise handwriting of a woman who had labeled everything she cared about since before her son was old enough to go to school. Owen R. Marsh, age 6. He sat with this. He sat with it for a long time in the warm room with the warming lamp and the sleeping dog and the 3 small animals against her belly. And he turned the glove over once more and held it in both hands, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the object had not already said more precisely than he could. His mother had written his name on his things so he would not lose them. He had not lost this one. He folded the glove carefully and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest, where it had been all morning. Nova's eye was still open, the one facing him, the side with the straight ear, the eye that had been looking at him since the bridge, since the moment she had walked out of the dark and sat down and decided, for whatever reason she had for deciding things, that he was who she had been looking for. He did not know what she had seen. He thought he might have some working theories. He put his hand flat on the padded surface, 6 inches from her nose. Not reaching, not asking, just present. Her muzzle moved. Slowly, the minimal effort of a body conserving what it had. She pressed her nose into his palm. Warm, steady. The full, unhurried press of an animal that had finished evaluating and had moved on to something else, something that did not require evaluation. He felt the warmth of her breath against his skin. Outside, through the small high window above the supply shelf, the November morning was fully arrived now, gray and cold and ordinary, the kind of morning that did not announce itself or offer any particular promise, the kind that simply came because it was the next thing after the night, reliable and indifferent and sufficient. Owen sat in the warm room and let it be morning. He thought about what his mother had said. Not the big decision. After. That's where I want you to find your feet. He looked at his hand against the padding. He looked at the 3 small animals sleeping. He looked at Nova's eye, still open, still steady, watching him with the patient, uncomplicated attention of an animal that had made its decision and was not revisiting it. He thought, I need to find somewhere to stay that allows dogs. It was a small thought, the smallest possible next thing, not a plan, not a decision about any of the larger questions that were still waiting, still unresolved, still sitting in the room with no windows that he had not yet found the door to. Just the smallest possible next thing. He sat with it. The clock in the front room ticked. The pups breathed. Nova breathed. Owen breathed, and the morning came through the window in the particular flat light of November in West Virginia, and none of it asked him for anything except to be present for it, and he found that he could do that. He found that he could do that. Sometimes God's greatest miracles do not arrive as wealth or success. They arrive as a second chance, a faithful companion, or an open door when every other door has closed. Nova did not come to that bridge to be rescued. She came to find the one person who was ready to be found. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs it today, leave a comment below, and subscribe for more stories of hope and second chances.